Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that once again I would talk about this topic in this conversation about the Naoya Inoue being rated as ESPN's Fighter of the Year. I thought that I would talk about this conversation and, of course, about the debate of who is the number one pound for pound fighter and this alleged racism and this alleged racial politics type of game. And of course, for those of you that know the LDBC and new media channels, we all know, for those of us that at least are intelligent enough to know what's going on, we all know basically what they're about. And like I've already stated for a multitude of times, and this is not me stating that they're the only racially motivated and possibly, two pro-racial of fans or channels out there or racist channels. But at the end of the day, like I've always said about the LDBC and new media, is that they are a pro-black cult. And just like I predicted with Mr. Naoya Inoue, I said that if Inoue ever should be mentioned debatably as the number one pound for pound fighter, that is eventually when they'll start going after him. Because certain people on my channel, they've said before, oh, well, they're not going after certain fighters like Inoue and other guys like that. I said eventually they will once they're debated as the number one pound for pound fighter. I know what their motivations, I know what their machinations are, and what their motivations and machinations are is to make sure that none other than American black fighters or black fighters are looked at as the best fighters in the sport or at the number one spot at the top of the pound for pound list. They can't have it look any other way. That is basically what their plans are. That is basically what their machinations are. That is what their true motivations are. And that is why every single time that there is a fighter that is looked to be that type of figure, whether it be Vasily Lomachenko, whether it be that of Gennady Golovkin, Naoya Inoue, Vasily Lomachenko, or Canelo Alvarez, they're always going to tear that fighter down. They're always going to have the most videos about that person. They're always going to try to put out the most agenda-driven propaganda. It just is what it is. And that doesn't mean that I necessarily disagree with every single one of the points that the LDBC or new media says about certain fighters, or that they may try to place certain non-black fighters over black fighters in order to make that of the black fighters look less dominant. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that statement. But once again, we have to know when we take a look at a debate, if we're comparing Inoue versus, say versus other fighters, or a black fighter like Terrence Bud Crawford, or, other certain fighters out there, we must know, for those of us that are analyzers and, project ourselves as that of logical and objective observers, we must ask ourselves, is this really a logical debate? Or is this something that really is not logical and clearly they're just trying to push this because of some racialism angle or some racist angle? And when you take a look at Terrence Bud Crawford versus Naoya Inoue, at least for fighter of the year, at the very least, in my personal view, you could debate either or of those fighters being the number one pound for pound fighter. But at the very least, for being fighter of the year, it's very debatable between at least those two and maybe even a third fighter. And the third fighter, of course, that you see that also could have easily won potential fighter of the year would have been that of Devin Haney, because of course he was able to beat Vasily Lomachenko, who was on some list as top 10 pound for pound. I did not have him there because, he did not, excuse me, beat any definitive A grade level fighters ever since his Teofimo Lopez fight, ever since he lost to him. And on top of that, he had no belts. So he wasn't on mine, but he certainly would have been within my top 15 and top 20 pound for pound. So Devin Haney deserves a lot of credit for that. And then, of course, he defeated another fighter that could have been debatably top 20. Probably not top 20 for me, but probably more likely top 30 in Regis Prograis. And, of course, he was able to get a very close decision over that of Vasily Lomachenko. And he was able to completely dominate that of Regis Prograis. The most dominant performance against that of Regis Prograis. So Devin Haney also deserves a great amount of consideration for Fighter of the Year. I think that those are pretty much the only two fighters this year that I would say would get Fighter of the Year. When it comes down to it. Those are probably the only three fighters that I would say would get consideration, at least for me this year, for Fighter of the Year. I think it would be Crawford, Haney, and that of Inoue. Who would personally be my vote? It just really depends on what you look at. A lot of the times, quality of the win, especially in terms of the resume, it does matter to me. So you could argue that Haney, you could argue that, Crawford, that debatably that their quality of wins, or at least especially with Haney, with his two, that maybe they were a little bit higher, or higher quality than that of Inoue's. If you wanted to debate it, you could. Crawford, of course, has that very high quality win and probably the biggest quality win of the year in that of Errol Spence Jr. But the other fight that he fought was a very low quality win against David Avanesian. And then of course you have Inoue against Paul Butler. I don't think that it was the highest quality win because I don't think Paul Butler was an A grade level champion, but he was a champion nonetheless. The Stephon Fulton fight was a fight against a top 20 pound per pound fighter in my view. He dominated him. And then, of course, against Marlon Tapales, who probably would have been a B grade win. So, once again, you could easily analyze or you could easily debate any one of these fighters as being the debatable fighter of the year. Now, if we were debating Canelo Alvarez in this discussion for only beating Jamel Charlo because he only fought one time this year, I believe, and he hadn't really fought anybody else, then I kind of understand, or maybe he fought John Ryder earlier in the year as well. I can't remember. But either way, if we're debating Canelo for fighter of the year, then I kind of understand where people would say that's a little bit more of a racialist angle because I just don't think Canelo did enough overall this year, and with the quality of fighters, even against Jamel Charlo, I don't think it would have been enough for fighter of the year. Then I would kind of understand it. If Usyk would have got fighter of the year for only beating Danny Dubois and, whoever else he beat this year, maybe Anthony Joshua, even though neither of those are bad wins, then I would kind of understand it because, you could say that none of those wins are quite the quality, or he didn't do quite as much as what a Crawford or what some of the other guys did, then I would understand. But the thing is about Inoue is that when you take a look at what he's done within these past 12 months, Inoue has been undisputed in two separate weight divisions within 1 year, within that of 12 months or 13 months. On top of that, every fighter that he fought was a champion. He dominated and stopped every single one of them. And one of those fighters in Stephon Coolboy Fulton were looked at as a top 20 pound for pound fighter. So a lot of these LDBC and new media channels, the part of the pro-black American cult, they're now saying that Inoue is the next fighter that they're trying to degrade black fighters with. And listen, to a degree, I'm sure that for a lot of the media that is somewhat their agenda. But once again, we need to take a look at it and say, is this actually a debate? Is this something that we can actually logically say? That is Naoya Inoue debatably the number one pound for pound fighter? Is he debatably fighter of the year? And the answer is yes. You could easily say yes for either one of those things, But the thing is with these channels is that they're going to allege overall that, when it comes down to it, it's all a part of their racial plan and all sort of stuff. And listen, I get it. But at the end of the day, there's only so much I can debate against that, even though I have Crawford as my number one pound for pound fighter. There's only so much that I can really argue about it or disagree with it when Inoue fought more times within this 12-month span. He fought more champions than Crawford, and both Crawford and Inoue were in a fight against a fighter that many people predicted them to lose against. And on top of that, Inoue was looked at as smaller than Stephon Coolboy Fulton. Crawford, many people would say that he was a bit smaller than Spence. I would say that they were more similar in size than what Inoue and Fulton were, but that could be debatable. So once again, I can't really have a huge problem with Naoya Inoue, being the debatable number one pound for pound fighter, or especially him being fighter of the year. But we're going to talk about this. This video is probably going to be much shorter because the video is not that long, but we're going to review Dante's Boxing Nation. Let's see what he has to say.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So we are now in a new generation of boxing. We are in an era where boxers actually speak out against double standards in the sport of boxing when it comes to old media. Boxers are exposing racist reporters, and they're exposing racial double standards in the sport. So while the majority of fans thought that the fighter of the year was going to be out of Terrence Crawford or Devin Haney, even Devin Haney and Terrence Crawford themselves thought it was going to be out of them too. Because Devin Haney actually started dissing Terrence Crawford, saying that he should be the fighter of the year over Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford came back and he put his bid in for why he should be the fighter of the year. And while they're beefing going back and forth.
Now, isn't that interesting that Devin Haney can debatably be fighter of the year? Even though he became undisputed last year, he didn't become undisputed this year. He defeated Lomachenko overall, who probably, according to the LDBC and new media, was not a top 10 pound for pound fighter, according to them. And then he defeats Regis Prograis, who also is not a top 10 pound for pound fighter. So they're perfectly okay with Devin Haney debatably getting fighter of the year, even though apparently the big buzz and the big debate about all this is that Crawford got the biggest win of the year, but yet they don't have a problem with Devin Haney getting fighter of the year. And if you had fighter of the year for Devin Haney, and even if you want to go as far to say that you think Devin Haney's quality of wins was maybe a bit higher than that of Inoue's, you could maybe go that far if you wanted to. But I would say Coolboy Fulton, at least with a lot of the way that the LDBC and new media and what some of the other people were covering him as, You could argue that the Cool Boy Fulton win was debatably right there with the Lomachenko win, and possibly a little bit higher than the Regis Prograis win. You could debate it because Stephen Fulton, all these LDBC and new media channels, especially Dante's Boxing Nation, they were all predicting Cool Boy Fulton to embarrass Naoya Inoue. That's what they were predicting, and then turns out Naoya Inoue ended up embarrassing Stephen Fulton.
ESPN is just laughing because they're saying to themselves, we weren't planning on giving it to either one of you guys. So they end up giving the Fighter of the Year award to Naoya Inoue. Despite the fact that ESPN, they were pushing extremely hard for the Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence fight for years, like all the fans.
Right, but you also were pushing very hard for the Naoya Inoue versus Stephen Coolboy Fulton fight. In fact, you went as far to say that you thought that Stephen Coolboy Fulton was going to be ducked or avoided by Naoya Inoue, and that he wouldn't even dare to take the fight because he knows that he would lose against a slick black American fighter, and Stephen Coolboy Fulton will just be too not skilled, or he will, Stephen Coolboy Fulton will be too good and too skilled for Inoue. So once again, there is no bigger hypocrisy than that of the LDBC and new media channels. Keep in mind with their top 10 pound per pound list that, apparently when it comes to resume and all this other bullshit, when Canelo Alvarez had a dozen A-grade wins in his career and he was defeating A-grade level champions and going up in weight, Terrence Bud Crawford was allegedly still the number one pound per pound guy because, he would beat Keith Thurman and beat all these guys, if he got in the ring with them, but they're avoiding him, all this other shit. Even though it was Crawford who refused to sign with that at the PBC and Al Heyman, even though it was Crawford's fault really in the first place. But when it came down to, Crawford's our number one because no one's more dominant than him, and all this other stuff, and then Deontay Wilder. Remember, Deontay Wilder was once upon a time one of their top 5 pound per pound fighters in the world. He was one of their top 5 pound per pound fighters in the world, according to Aki TV and Dante's Boxing Nation, over that of Anthony Joshua at one point in time, who had more belts and more of a resume than that of Deontay Wilder, but they always put Deontay Wilder over Anthony Joshua. So once again, let's get this straight. The LDBC and new media channels are not about logic. They're not about objectivity. All they are they're there to project their American liberalized victimization pro-black cult mentality. That's all they're there for.
There's no doubt about it. Terrence Crawford, he deserved to be Fighter of the Year. Now,
No, there is a doubt about it because at the end of the day, Terrence Bud Crawford only fought once this whole entire year. And if we're talking about the span within the past 12 to 13 months, he's fought 2 people. Of course, the Errol Spence Jr. win was the biggest win of the year. I don't think that there would be any debate or argument about that if you wanted to go that far. However, the problem also is that he only won 3 belts this year compared to Naoya Inoue's. If you want to count the past 12 months, Naoya Inoue has won that of 5 belts, and he's been undisputed now in 2 separate weight divisions within the past 12 months. On top of that, every single one of the fighters that he's fought has been a champion. Stephen Coolboy Fulton, according to Dante, and a lot of these guys, he was top 10 pound for pound, according to them, and he was going to lose to Stephen Coolboy Fulton. So at the end of the day, you don't have to say that Coolboy Fulton was on the same level as Spence, but what you would have to say is that Inoue got a definitive A-grade win against a fighter that, in your view, was top 10 pound per pound. Over Naoya Inoue, I believe, overall in your guys' view. So once again, you would have to give Naoya Inoue a lot of credit, and if you're logical, and if you're going to keep the same standards, you can't really have a huge problem with Naoya Inoue either being the number one pound per pound fighter or getting Fighter of the Year. But once again, they go to show you once again what their true motivations are.
ESPN, they do have Terrence Crawford as pound for pound number 1, the best fighter in the world.
Right, and you're still not happy with that. Basically, the LDBC and new media, they act like the regular American pro-black cult. They're not happy with anything. They're always going to bitch. They're always going to complain. They're always going to be emotional. They're not happy with anything. They could have Terrence Bud Crawford as the number one pound for pound fighter. They need it all. They need you to believe that overall that the top 10 pound per pound list, that it basically consists of nothing but American black fighters. And if it's like that in the reality and in a logical way, cool. That's great. When you talk about American black fighters that are probably on that top 10 pound per pound list right now, you're probably talking about Terrence Crawford. You're debatably talking about Spence, but he probably wouldn't even be on that list anymore for me. Not after the way that he lost and the fact that he only had work within one weight division. Of course, we're talking about Devin Haney, Shakur Stevenson. And to be honest with you, that really might be about it. Because Gervonta Tank Davis, he can't be on there. He doesn't have the resume. and he's really only a champion, a legitimate champion in one weight division, as far as I'm concerned, because I do not count lineal belts or regular titles and all sort of bullshit. I only count one of the official 4 belts. That's usually, what I count, unless maybe you wanted to go a step further, like for example, when Manny Pacquiao beat Ricky Hatton and he ended up winning the IBO title. If you wanted to maybe do that because it was still against an A-grade level fighter, so say Gervonta Tank Davis, say he ended up defeating Teofimo Lopez for the IBO title, or if he ended up defeating him overall for the super title or something like that, then okay, I can kind of count that if you want to go that far. And I'm not even quite sure if I would still go by those standards because I really only count one of the 4 main titles as you being a champion in that weight division. But, that would depend on you. But anyways, when it comes down to the overall, once again, those are the only 3 black American fighters right now that, in my view, would probably be on my top 10 pound per pound list in a logical way. I don't know who else you would really have there. It also, the pound for pound list also consists of Canelo. It also consists of Inoue. It also consists, that of Alexander Usyk, probably Tyson Fury in my view, or Beef, Dimitri Bivol. It consists of all those fighters.
And I believe that's the reason why they felt they could justify giving Naoya Inoue Fighter of the Year. But it still doesn't add up because even ESPN, they had Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford in their top 5 when it comes to pound for pound best fighters in the world. And Terrence Crawford not only beat Errol Spence, but he completely dominated him, made it look easy.
Yes, he did, and Naoya Inoue did the same thing to Steve Von Fulton. Listen, I understand what Dante's point is about this. I do. But at the end of the day, Terrence Bud Crawford did only fight 1 time this year. On top of that, he won less belts than Naoya Inoue. Inoue still overall, he won more belts. He was undisputed in 2 separate weight divisions within a 12-month span. He fought all champions. You don't have to say that every single one of those champions was an A-grade fighter. One of them probably wasn't even a B-grade fighter if you want to go that far. But at the end of the day, Naoya Inoue, you can certainly debate him as the fighter of the year.
And the most highly
And once again, if you think that Terrence Bud Crawford should win fighter of the year because overall of the big win over Errol Spence Jr., even though he only fought once this year or 2 times within a 12-month span, but the other fighter was David Avanesian, who is probably a C-grade level fighter. No problem. But then why do you not have a problem with Devin Haney winning fighter of the year? So once again, as long as it is a black American fighter, they don't care. If Naoya Inoue was overall that of, Tyrell, overall Biggs. Now, I know he was once upon a time a heavyweight fighter, but just making up a name here. If his name was Tyrell Johnson, and he was overall down there and he did all this stuff, they wouldn't care about Naoya Inoue winning fighter of the year. And they would very much debatably have him overall as the number 1 pound for pound fighter. Remember, these are the same people that once upon a time claimed that Deontay Wilder was the best heavyweight in the world and all around the number 1 heavyweight in the world, even though he had never fought any competition. And on top of that, he never won the same amount of belts as AJ or Tyson Fury. Keep that in mind.
Anticipated fight since Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao. Speaking of Floyd Mayweather, ESPN did pretty much the same thing to Floyd Mayweather that they did to Terrence Crawford. After years and years of ESPN pushing hard for the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, a lot of analysts and commentators were implying that Floyd Mayweather, he was ducking Manny Pacquiao. As soon as he fought and beat Manny Pacquiao, ESPN, they gave the Fighter of the Year award, not to Floyd Mayweather, they gave it to Ronda Rousey over Floyd Mayweather.
Well, what I'll say is this, and I can't really tell you what Ronda did that year, but I remember when Ronda Rousey was getting all that hype behind her, she was being majorly pushed by that of the feminist movement and by that of the liberal agenda. So there was a clear reason kind of behind why they wanted Ronda Rousey to be that hyped up. She was a very big tool overall for the feminists and that of the liberal agenda to use. That way they could kind of poison certain people's minds with that argument. And they used her and they played her like a violin. That's why Ronda Rousey said all this stuff about, I could beat Floyd Mayweather Jr. in a boxing match and all this sort of stuff, and I can beat some men. And we see Claressa Shields, who I'm going to have to talk about very soon, have a very, very similar energy. And when she was on the Ring magazine of boxing, that certainly was something that was ridiculous. That never should have happened. But there was something deeper that was going on there.
Rousey, she would get knocked out the same year ESPN gave her the Fighter of the Year award. 2 years ago, Shakur Stevenson, he was pushing really hard for Fighter of the Year. And ESPN, they gave Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez the Fighter of the Year award over Shakur Stevenson. Like I said, before...
Well, you would have to take a look and see who Shakur Stevenson beat over that of Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez. Because I believe Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, when he had won Fighter of the Year, he had beaten a former top 10 pound-per-pound fighter, and that is Sorong Visai. So... you know, at the end of the day, maybe it's a little bit understandable. Now, to be fair, I would have to take a look at it.
You had a lot of black boxers that were terrified. They were afraid to speak on these double standards in the sport of boxing. But not anymore, because a lot...
I don't think that they've ever truly been 100% terrified of speaking on the double standards of boxing. I just think that some of these guys that... I don't think overall that, you know, they bitch, moan, and complain as much as what you do. Now, some of them do, and some of them think that it's a robbery that Terrence Bud Crawford didn't get Fighter of the Year. Listen, that's all up to you. But unfortunately, you know, especially in America, what this liberalism movement does, you know, with that of the women or that of the minority groups or just really in people in general, doesn't really matter who you are. They teach you overall to be very emotional. They teach you to bitch, moan, and complain and always make excuses and to play into the victimization mentality. Now, once again, had Alexander Usyk or Tyson Fury won Fighter of the Year, then you could say, yeah, definitely a robbery. There's no way that he ended up winning that. You know, there's no chance that I would have ever possibly given to him, at least not for the year. But you're talking about a fighter that became undisputed in 2 separate weight classes within a 12-month span, fought 3 champions, and fought 2 champions with 2 belts. And was able to unify a division where he was smaller, you know, than the rest of those guys at that division. So once again, I don't really see this application of, oh, it's a robbery. The only reason why these guys are saying it, once again, is because they just have way too much racial motivation. They put way too much racial motivation overall within a lot of these fights.
A lot of fighters are speaking out. They're using their huge platform and their huge influence to highlight what's going on in the sport. And if more boxers keep doing this, all of this will change overnight. Because the more they come together to expose this, the more irrelevant their award shows and their pound-for-pound lists become. Now, because of the power of social media, there are...
And once again, the LDBC and New Media's pound-for-pound list, they also make no sense whatsoever. Basically, what their pound-for-pound list is how many black American fighters can I put on my top 10 pound-for-pound list? That's why some of their spots and, you know, these standards that they're spouting off of, oh, Terrence Crawford got the biggest win of the year. Right, so if we're talking about those level of standards, then why did you have Terrence Bud Crawford above Canelo Alvarez even when he was fighting several A-grade level fighters and had already beaten several A-grade level fighters like Gennady Golovkin and Lara and all this other stuff? And you can claim that you thought that he lost those fights, blah, 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 all you want to. Isn't it interesting, though, the same standards would not apply to that of Jamel Charlo and Brian Castano or Andre Ward versus Sergey Kovalev when a lot of people thought that Ward lost to Kovalev. He was still ranked as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter for them. So, once again, if you're going to hold these standards, no problem. I may agree with you, I may disagree with you, but at least be consistent. Don't be a hypocrite.
Starting to become irrelevant because boxing fans on Twitter, Instagram, they're constantly exposing these double standards by sending messages directly to racist reporters and commentators that work for some of these networks. And then you have boxers like Antonio Tarver who came out and he said something that's going to get a lot of people's attention. And when I say a lot of people, I'm not just talking about the boxing fans. I'm talking about other boxers that will most likely be influenced to start pointing out these double standards as well. So Antonio Tarver, he spoke on the whole situation comparing Terrence Crawford to Inoue. So Tarver, he came out and he said, they got to stop this. Who has he beat? That's disrespectful. We haven't seen enough of Inoue. And answer me this. How many pound-for-pound champions has he defeated? He ain't fought no top five.
Right, but here's also the question. And if Terrence Bud Crawford was someone like Canelo Alvarez or someone like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Pacquiao where they had defeated a multitude of top 10 or top 20 pound-for-pound champions, then I would get it. But let's also be real about Mr. Terrence Bud Crawford here. Other than the Errol Spence Jr. win, how many top 10 pound-for-pound fighters or even top 20 pound-for-pound fighters has Terrence Bud Crawford really beaten? How many? Because was Sean Porter really a top 20 pound-for-pound fighter when he ended up defeating him? No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. So let's just get that out of the way. Was Victor Postal a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter? Absolutely not. So let's get that out of here. Top 20? Maybe. Maybe you could have put him top 20. But in my view, he probably would have been potentially more probably that a top 30, just in my personal view. Yuriorkis Gamboa may be on the verge of top 10 pound for pound, but probably more top 20. So I'll give Terrence Bud Crawford that. I'll give Terrence Bud Crawford that, where Terrence Bud Crawford probably defeated one certain top 10 or top 5 pound for pound fighter, and then he probably defeated another top, 15 to top 20 pound for pound fighter in Yuriorkis Gamboa, and maybe another top 20 pound for pound fighter in Victor Postol. I'll give him that. Okay? I'll give him that. Naoya Inoue has only defeated one top 20 to top 10 pound for pound fighter in Stephon Coolboy Fulton. So that's why I say that Crawford right now is my number one pound for pound fighter, because Terrence Bud Crawford, in my view, has the better resume over Inoue just by a little bit. Because it's not like Crawford, for his whole entire career, has just been fighting repeated A-grade level champions. And if we're going to be real, a lot of the champions that he's fought have not been A-grade. Ricky Burns was not A-grade. All right, Raimundo Beltran, if he even was a champion when Crawford fought him, he was not A-grade. Okay? I'm not even sure if Yuriorkis Gamboa 100% was A-grade, but I'll give Crawford, that A-grade level there. All right, so yes, Crawford deserves to be the number one pound for pound fighter at the moment, but if Inoue is going to get fighter of the year, because he also fought a top 20 pound for pound fighter at the very least, he fought more times within a 12-month span, and on top of that, he won more belts and was undisputed in 2 weight classes within a 12-month span, then so be it. So, these guys, the pro-black American cult, they can claim all they want to about, Inoue robbed Crawford, all this sort of stuff. Well, at the end of the day, no problem. If you're going to keep those standards, and if you believe that Crawford deserved the win, no problem. But then you also should have been saying that the other years when Canelo was defeating Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant within the same year, and Crawford was defeating bums like Aegis Kavalaskas and Jose Benavidez. Because they still believed, apparently, that Crawford was the number one pound for pound fighter and that he should have been debatably fighter of the year that year, or some other black fighter. So, once again, I don't have a problem, if your standards are consistent and if you're not going to be a hypocrite, but at the end of the day, a lot of these channels just are not.
Fighter in those lighter weight divisions with no real names in them. That can't count as much as those glamour divisions where top fighters are known to roam.
Right, where top fighters are known to roam, but how many of those fighters has Terrence Bud Crawford really fought? Especially within the past year. He fought David Avanesian. Is David Avanesian some glamour fighter? Or is he a journeyman that has already lost several times in his career? And then of course Errol Spence Jr., great win, the best win of the year, absolutely. If that's what you wanted to use as your point to make Crawford the number one guy or the fighter of the year, no problem, have no problem with that whatsoever. But you can't get too mad for him losing it to Inoue, who's fought more times within the past year, won more belts than him within the past year, been undisputed in more weight divisions than him, at least within that of the past year, and been just as dominant as him. So once again, and fought more champions than him, and one of those guys also was a top 20 to top 10 pound for pound fighter, at least debatably on some list within Stephon Coolboy Fulton. So once again, I can't get too mad at this. I can't claim robbery.
In the top 10, and until someone defeats Terrence Crawford, he's the pound for pound champ. Stop playing with his name and his brand.
Well, I agree. Right now, Terrence Bud Crawford is the number one pound for pound fighter, but they didn't say that Terrence Bud Crawford was not the number one pound for pound fighter. They just said that Naoya Inoue was the best fighter of the year, or that he had the best year, that basically he won the MVP. That's all they're saying. And you notice that a lot of these guys, they keep saying that there's no debate, that Crawford is, clearly, overall the number one pound for pound fighter. Right, but when it comes to the fighter of the year, that's not what it's about. You can be the number one pound for pound fighter and not win fighter of the year. It just is what it is. Just like in basketball and in the NFL, you can be the best quarterback in the league. Patrick Mahomes right now is the best quarterback in the league. He's not going to win the MVP this year. That's probably going to be Lamar Jackson. When it comes down to it right now, Nikola Jokic is the best player in all of basketball and all the NBA, at least probably at the moment. Some of course would debate Giannis or, maybe Steph Curry. And, you could have debates with those guys, but because of Jokic and his recent MVPs and also his championship, which he won recently, I'd probably have to put him in number one. But he's the best player in the league right now. That doesn't mean overall that he's going to win the MVP this year. So once again, there's a difference between being ranked as the number one pound for pound fighter and fighter of the year. But the thing is that these guys once again are so racially motivated that they're not even happy that they ranked Terrence Bud Crawford at the number one pound for pound spot. They have to have him as the best fighter of the year. They have to have him as the number one pound for pound fighter. They have to have it as the undisputed title. Because once again, what their worst nightmare is that 20, 30 years later on down the line, that fighters like Inoue and Usyk and Fury and other guys like that, and Canelo, that they're going to be in the same conversations as guys like Floyd Mayweather, Muhammad Ali, and other stuff like that. Whether you agree with it or not, but that's the reason why they got to make sure that these fighters don't get ranked as the number one pound for pound fighter. Because if they're remembered as the best of their generation, then what does that mean? That means that debatably later on they could possibly be in the greatest of all time conversation. And they know that, and they don't want that.
Build Inoue's name off.
That's why these guys are already talking about that at Tyson Fury. Like, overall, well, I will never put him as the greatest heavyweight of all time, no matter what he does. And when someone says that, I can never put him as the greatest, or I can never put him on this level, no matter what he accomplishes, what he's telling you, or what that person is telling you, is that I have a bias. I already have my mind made up, so don't trust my opinion.
Of his fights, not off the pound for pound discussion. That is an excellent point. Build Inoue's name off of his fights, not off of a pound for pound discussion. This is what old media has been doing since day one. As soon as old media finds a fighter on the hope list, which just means he's not black, he could be brand new in the game, has one decent win, and even if no one knows who he is, even if he hasn't even fought in America yet, old media will start saying that he's pound for pound the best fighter in the world, over a Terrence Crawford, over an Andre Ward. This is exactly what they did with Chocolatito Gonzalez. While a fighter like...
Well, what I'm going to say is this. I understand even the outrage when it comes to Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez. Because Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, even though he was a multiple weight division champion and undefeated, none of the fighters that he really defeated were top 10 pound for pound. So that's something that's a little bit more understandable. Or if you were going to rank Gennady Golovkin or Sergey Kovalev as the number one pound for pound fighter, that's understandable. If we're talking about those guys because they didn't quite have the resume nor the accomplishments, or at least some of them, that's something that's a little bit understandable. But then when you associate people like Vasily Lomachenko when he was on his run, or Canelo Alvarez, or Naoya Inoue, that's just something that I can't agree with. Because are we really going to sit here and allege that those guys, that they weren't worth debatably being the number one pound for pound fighter at all? I mean, what if Terrence Bud Crawford had lost to Errol Spence Jr. this year? You know, what would his resume really look like? You know, beat a Victor Postol, who in my view never was really an A-grade level fighter. Beat a Yuriorkis Gamboa, who overall was already smaller than him anyway. And on top of that was a guy that I'm not really 100% sure if he's A-grade anyway. So it's like, you know, when it comes down to it, it's like, you know, these guys always want to say, see, we told you that he was never the number one pound for pound fighter. Right, well, here's the question. You once upon a time had certain fighters like Wilder within your top 5 pound for pound. So does that mean that Wilder was just, you know, a complete hype job and that he never had any substance to him? Once again, we have to take things overall by a yearly basis, at least when it comes to certain things, or at least with what they're accomplishing. So if you're talking about Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez or Gennady Golovkin or Sergey Kovalev not being deserving of the number one pound for pound spot or fighter of the year, I can somewhat understand that. What I can agree with is with certain fighters like Lomachenko, when he was defeating A-grade fighters like Nicholas Walters, Gary Russell Jr., Guillermo Rigondeaux, and then Jorge Linares at 135. Canelo fighting Danny Jacobs, Gennady Golovkin, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, you know, then Jamel Charlo, Dimitri Bivol, you know, all these guys, you know, and then Naoya Inoue, you know, who recently got the biggest A-grade win of his career, and he probably has a multitude of A-grade wins. On top of that, he's debatably the most dominant fighter this year, right there with Terrence Bud Crawford. He fought more times than Terrence Bud Crawford. He fought more champions than Terrence Bud Crawford this year, and on top of that, he won more belts. So what really is there to complain about?
Andre Ward or Terrence Crawford has to be in the game for like 10 years, putting in serious work. Roman Gonzalez, he fights on maybe...
What serious work did Terrence Bud Crawford really put in before he went up to that and fought Sean Porter in that overall of Errol Spence Jr.? Now, don't get me wrong. That's not me saying that he didn't win a lot of belts. But if we're going to complain about Naoya Inoue not beating that of the highest quality of competition, and at times I would agree with that. I'm not going to completely disagree with that. I think that there's a little bit of substance with that point. But at the end of the day, it's like, dude, who did Terrence Bud Crawford really defeat at 135? I mean, he defeated Yuriorkis Gamboa, and that's great. All the other fighters were what? Ricky Burns? Ricky Burns is not a A-grade level fighter. He never has been. You know, isn't it funny that all these guys claim that the British fighters are weak and that, you know, he's fighting these European bums and, you know, these British fighters, but Terrence Bud Crawford defeats Ricky Burns, you know, and then Aki TV and Dante are like, well, Terrence Crawford defeated Ricky Burns when he was Ricky Burns. Right, but who the fuck was Ricky Burns? Is Ricky Burns ever going to be an A-grade level fighter? The answer is no. Okay, he fought Raimundo Beltran, and then he moves up to 140. He fought Thomas Delorme, never an A-grade fighter. Julius Ndongo, never an A-grade fighter. Victor Postal, maybe an A-grade level fighter, but I'd probably give him the class a B plus. When it comes down, I'd probably give him the class a B plus. And then it wasn't really until welterweight when he fought that of Sean Porter and that of Errol Spence, where he fought the definitive A-grade level fighters. So once again, people can sit here and act like that, oh, Terrence Crawford, he's putting in serious work. In terms of accomplishments and belts, absolutely. Terrence Bud Crawford was putting in a lot of work, and in terms of getting a lot of fights. In terms of the resume, no. The one that overall probably was putting in the most serious amount of work within that of the past several years in terms of a resume was that of Canelo Alvarez.
2 or 3 undercards, and old media starts saying that he's the best fighter in the world. Now he's the Michael Jordan of the sport. Just imagine if this was an even...
And that's why DontaesBoxingNation overall always claims that. He says now he's the Michael Jordan of the sport. And you know why he says that once again? Because like I said, because their worst fear is basically overall that these fighters later on, that they're going to be remembered as all-time greats, or that they're going to be remembered over that of certain fighters like Ali, Floyd Mayweather. That's why they keep using these phrases like the Michael Jordan of the sport. Right, but you don't have a problem with Crawford being looked at as the Michael Jordan of the sport, even though he's never even close to fought an A-grade level fighter, or at least a fighter that would have been looked at on the top 10 pound-per-pound list before he fought Errol Spence Jr. You would have never had a problem with that.
Playing field. That would mean that Terrence Crawford wouldn't have to do half the stuff that he has done in his career to be considered pound for pound the best fighter in the world. If they treated Floyd Mayweather...
Now, if you want to say that ESPN and some of these other, media sites that they are a little bit racially biased in their analyses, or that they do try to put certain fighters over that of black fighters to make the black fighters seem less dominant, I think that you certainly can make a debate about that, because Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, in my view, probably was not very deserving, or at least 100% of that number 1 pound-per-pound spot. And you could argue that with other fighters as well. And there's been certain Asian fighters within the lower weight divisions that, in my view, didn't quite deserve to be on that pound-per-pound spot, overall, like that Ryoto Murata guy, or, whatever his name is, and some of the other fighters that, I hear about. Yes, you certainly can make that point. But to make it the same point, and this is why a lot of people think that these channels are full of shit, because a lot of times they are. I can't agree with this point that Naoya Inoue overall is just not deserving whatsoever of Fighter of the Year. I can't agree with that point.
The way they treated Roman Gonzalez, Floyd should have been considered pound for pound the best fighter in the world when he won his first world title against Gennaro Hernandez. He should have been considered the best before he even fought Diego Corrales. Floyd wasn't even considered number 1 the best fighter in the world after he stopped Corrales. But Roman Gonzalez was considered number 1 over Andre Ward? How does that make any logical sense, guys?
Well, once again, I kind of somewhat agree with you on the Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez thing. However, you're also missing the fact that Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, by the time that they put him as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, he was also, I believe, at that time a 3-weight division champion. So if you wanted to kind of put that out there, I still probably would have not put him as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, at least taking a look at it now. But once again, these are the same guys that claim that Crawford, he's undefeated, he's the most dominant, even though he's not facing fighters that really are that talented, like Jeff Horn and a washed-up version of Kell Brook and Amir Khan, fighters that would never the same, and they know that, but yet they still want to put Terrence Bud Crawford at the number 1 pound-for-pound spot. So either you're highly delusional and idiotic, and you don't know what the hell you're talking about, or B, you're very biased, potentially a mix of both.
Once again, according to old media's pound-for-pound list, which is the reason why their list has no credibility anymore.
Your list really doesn't have any credibility either, Dante. And I hate to tell you this, but probably the worst old media list other than that of Boxing Rec. They probably have about 20 times more credibility than any of the LDBC's pound-for-pound list, because what they've showed is that basically they're old media, but worse.
With that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. Let me tell you guys...
But anyways, that's pretty much about it. I just thought that I would talk about that once again. That might be the last time that I talk about this conversation. But once again, I can't bitch, moan, and complain too much that Naoya Inoue is getting Fighter of the Year over Crawford or Haney when he fought all champions this year. On top of that, he defeated a top 20 to top 10 pound-for-pound fighter easily. He is debatably the most dominant fighter in the world. He fought the most amount of times within the past 12 months. And on top of that, he won the most amount of belts. So I can't really, get after them too much for claiming him as the number one pound for pound or the fighter of the year, but especially fighter of the year. So it is what it is. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.